Hello, welcome to Today Tomorrow. My name's Kate Goodwin and I'm Head of Architecture and Curator at the Royal Academy. And it's lovely to see you all here. Thank you. Sorry, it took me a couple of minutes to get all the technology up and running. This is the first time I've had a chance to do the Instagram Live, and it's fantastic to be here. So just while I wait for my partner in crime to join me, I might just introduce the series, which is a series of interviews that are going to be taking place every Tuesday and Thursday throughout June. It's a partnership between the Royal Academy and Citizen magazine, and which is, if you don't know it, it is a fantastic publication that comes out of the London School of Architecture. And they launched last summer and have had 2 issues thus far. And the editor, Isabel Allen, and I will both be interviewing some of the fantastic contributors that they've had. I'll be doing the interviews on Tuesdays, and she's here 11 a.m. every Thursday. And just by way of introduction, I think Citizen magazine is fantastic. I read the first issue last summer, and as I leafed through it, I was like, this is exactly the sort of stuff that we need to be talking about. And it was, and also the way in which it was done. You know, there was an interview with a conversation between Richard Sennett and Henrietta, and it enthused me with the sort of things that it was talking about. It really chimed with what we're interested in at the Royal Academy, which is sort of connecting architecture with how we live, and also a better way of living and a more sustainable way of living. I think there we are. Finn looks as though he's come in. There we are. Let me just introduce Finn. Harries is going to come. But just as while we wait for Finn, a little bit more on Citizen. I think what is... Hi Finn, how are you?
Hey Kate, how's it going?
Nice to see you. Good. I was just doing a bit of an intro into Citizen, so I'll just do my last little bit if I do, just to give people a context to it, and also I guess probably a context to our conversation. But I think for me what is fantastic is it kind of harnesses the interdisciplinary intelligences, which is so important. Rather than thinking in silos, it's thinking collectively, creatively, and about, you know, bringing kind of shared knowledge and determination together on, I guess, on these issues which are so critical. And I guess it's a really amazing, you know, quite a pressing moment, isn't it, with civic society is kind of under so much pressure. It's on the brink of something, and it was fantastic to see this last issue of Citizen being given over to the issue of climate change, which was so pressing, I think, for so many of us until this pandemic came up. And I think the whole idea of, I guess, Citizen is that actually citizens do hold power and can make change. And I was so impressed by seeing, you know, what Isabel and the team have kind of, the people they've reached out to, and the game changers like yourself who are amazing. You know, it's not just people who, you know, I think everybody in the magazine is visionary, but also they're doers. And that sense that actually as citizens, it is in our power to make a change is super inspiring. And I think to have you here, you embed all of those things, you know, as a designer, a filmmaker, activist, and hopefully soon to be architect. It's, you know, you've having launched the YouTube channel with your twin brother back in 2011, Jack's Gap, following, you know, 4 years around the world traveling. But also I think that moment where, I think it was 2015, wasn't it, when you went to Greenland with the World Wildlife Fund and actually looked at the looked at the changing, the, you know, the shifting glaciers, and going to Somaliland, looking at drought, and actually bringing these awareness to public attention. And seeing now, having spent 4 years, I think, at Parsons, studying architecture, majoring in architecture, doing the minor in the environmental studies, now here at the AA, and also sort of right there at the beginning with Extinction Rebellion. I think, you know, it's super inspiring when you sort of read through your CV and see what you've done in those last years, and so young is fantastic. And for those who haven't seen Finn's contribution to Citizen, it was an impassioned and amazing call to arms, really, to say to the education system, we need to change. You know, these students go through 7 years, study, and come out the other end ill-equipped to actually deal with what is the biggest crisis facing that generation for whom it rests in their hands. And Finn, thank you for that letter. It was great. But I wondered if you could, how do you know, you wrote it 4 months ago, before this pandemic, before these things, you know, how does it feel looking at that moment when you sat down to write that letter and sitting at today? You know, this series is Today, Tomorrow. What does today look like for you, looking back at what that was?
Yeah, well, first off, thanks very much for having me on here. This is my first ever Instagram live, so I'm excited to be able to take part and to be able to talk with you. Yeah, so as you mentioned, all of my sort of educational understanding of climate change or some of the environmental threats we face in the future were developed when I was at Parsons School of Design. And that really exposed me to a sort of a whole world that I had not been privy to before. And it really fired me up. I think on reflection now, it's only having graduated from Parsons School of Design and having come back to London that I realized how valuable that education was. And in a way, how unique it was. Parsons is quite a progressive school. It's based on social research, and it has this great connection with sister universities because it's part of this broader collective called the New School. And so while I was there, as you mentioned, I did this minor in environmental studies. And for me, climate change very quickly became the most pressing issue that I felt I would face as a sort of individual, as an architect in the future, but also collectively. And so it really pushed me into trying to find ways to take action within my own work. Like, you know, what role do designers and architects have in trying to mitigate, but also adapt to the impacts of climate change? I think that's one of the critical things to understand, is that we're at a point now with this challenge where it's not just stopping it. We know that some change is going to happen to us to some degree, and the question is, how can we best prepare for it? And so I started at the Architectural Association last year, very fired up on this issue and really ready to ask some of those tricky questions. And what I found was that the education I was receiving at Parsons was different to the one that's being offered at the AA. And I think that institutions are still trying to catch up with the necessary shift that's required in order to address climate change, because it's quite a deep pedagogical shift, as I mentioned in my article. And so when I wrote that article, I was quite angry. I was quite distressed in a way, because, you know, I, like many people, read a lot of information around climate change, and it can be really overwhelming and very daunting. And we're given these sort of impossible timelines of sort of shifting global society within 10 years. Otherwise, you know, worst case scenarios will unfold. So it can really take a toll on our mental health as well. And that's something I was experiencing, and that's something I really openly talk about, because I think it's important to understand when we're doing this work that we have to look after ourselves first, before we sort of try and take action, which is like deep shifts. Like, it takes a lot of our energy to try, and we're talking about an existential crisis as well. So it's just to sort of mull on that is quite a big ask of any individual. So I wrote the article feeling very frustrated, and what I was most daunted by when I wrote it was that global, like, contemporary life feels like it was moving so fast that we weren't stopping to think about where we were going. And it felt very hard to imagine how we could start to create the shifts that I feel are required. And then suddenly the pandemic hit, and we have been forced to slow down. Yeah. And although, of course, the pandemic is a tragedy and not something that should be referred to as sort of a great, you know, a good thing to happen, but there are opportunities that arise from this tragedy. And that for me has been to slow down, to reflect, to have the opportunity to think about what we collectively should be valuing most. And I think it's shown all of us that we have this great capacity to respond in the face of existential crisis quite quickly, and that we're willing to forego some of our liberties in order to protect the sort of greater collective well-being of the community. And so I think that those are really interesting insights. And so now, reflecting on that article, I feel a greater sense of clarity and a little bit more calm, because because we have this unprecedented opportunity to really critically reflect now, as we try and return back to some degree of normal, and certainly it won't be normal life as we knew it before, that it's a sort of new normal. How do we take that opportunity? How do we redefine, in the case of education, the way we learn about the world around us, the way we think about building our cities in the context of climate change, but also other disasters like future pandemics. You know, this is something that perhaps is guaranteed to happen again in the future. So for me, the key theme here is resilience, and that's been a big focus for me over the last couple of weeks, is how do we build greater resilience into our cities, into our communities, in the face of these very complex and very daunting challenges that we're facing now, but that we know we'll continue to face in the future.
So what are those things that have come to mind? Actually, maybe I'll wind back a little bit. How have you found you've gone through the roller coaster? I mean, I think that everyone sort of talks about the pandemic, of that things do come into focus. Suddenly, you know, there's fear, there's hope, that shift. Have you been experiencing that kind of shift that's opened up? Because I think it's quite interesting in the shift. I think sort of possibilities start to open. We really have to pull back, question ourselves. And I'm wondering, you know, what did you really strip off and come to? And then also the strange thing of, you know, sitting in isolation, but also watching collective action come into being. And I just kind of wondered how you're thinking around both that relationship between being an individual and going through everything one does, and actually collective action, which you've been such a part of for so long, you know, getting other people to work.
Yeah, I spent probably, like most people, during the first 2 weeks of this pandemic, having already been burnt out just by day-to-day life, as I'm sure most people are. I felt really overwhelmed. I felt that the last thing we needed was another global crisis to deal with. And as I touched on, like mental health is something that I sort of speak about publicly, and it just took a worse impact on my mental health for the first 2 weeks. But what's been interesting to me is how quickly we adapt to scenarios as they unfold. And again, that gives me sort of a weird sense of optimism for a future that looks quite different to the one we're in now. So, you know, if you told me that I was going to spend 3 months, or that we collectively were going to spend nearly 3 months in quarantine, I would have imagined it would be much worse than it actually has been. And sure, that comes with some degree of, you know, a sense of privilege that we're able to have a roof over our head and be in a safe space during that time. But, you know, I think seeing how quickly we have been able to adapt to this new normal, and like I mentioned before, how willingly we have given up some of the things that we take for granted, some of the privileges that we normally enjoy, is really interesting to me. And so after the first 2 weeks, I sort of snapped into this new strange routine that we've all been living, of spending a huge amount of time sort of stuck inside and reflecting and thinking, and also engaging with these new digital tools. One of the interesting takeaways over this period for me has been to start to question, like, the legitimacy of the classroom as a place of learning. And again, this sort of comes back to my article, like how legitimate are universities in terms of their, like, as a geographical place to go to gain information and knowledge. And one of the things I've been doing over the last couple of weeks is doing online courses and reading a lot more than I previously would, because we've had this you know, I've had more time than I normally do. And so perhaps out of this, we start to redefine the way we learn. You know, the way I've been able to connect and gain knowledge from people beyond my local community, people in the US, people in Australia. So, you know, that's quite an interesting takeaway. Perhaps the future of learning and education looks like one that's more decentralized and in that sense more democratic, that we can access it from the comfort of our home. And that's not to undermine the benefit of being in a collaborative environment. I certainly miss, you know, being around other people where you sort of rub off each other in terms of creative ideas. But I do think that at a time where I believe a lot of our education is not fit for purpose, given some of these complex challenges we're facing, this opportunity to approach education in a different way, in a decentralized way, and to access knowledge that is really fresh on the internet as well. That's one of the things that I feel frustrated by, is that universities often get caught in traditional pedagogy, so like antiquated methods of teaching, because that's just what they've done before, so they feel like that's what they should keep doing. Whereas the internet and the digital space is really contemporary. It's very cutting edge. It's, you know, it's very instant. And so I've been able to gain access to this information that's literally just been published, you know, last week, the week before that. And I think that is something that we can carry into this new strange normal that we're going into. Yeah.
You also, in your article, you critique often some of the kind of the institutions, and obviously say these pedagogies, they sit and they haven't evolved. I'm wondering, is it just the institutions, or do you find actually that you're finding intergenerational, is it something that is concerning your generation, or do you find it's something shared by tutors and others in there, but actually the system isn't actually giving that sort of space to enable kind of bigger thinking?
Yeah, that's been one of the interesting processes I've been going on specifically at the AA. So I'm part of a small group at the AA called AA Action, and we're committed to driving pedagogical change in response to the climate crisis. And so we spent a lot of time working together to identify what's stopping the school from shifting or adapting. And like you said, it's worth mentioning, it's not really the individuals. You know, teachers, educators tend to be very well-informed people, and they have the best interest of the students at heart. And so a lot of the time I've met with professors or teachers who are really keen to integrate this into their syllabus or their curriculum, but they are first and foremost daunted by, one of the interesting things about climate change is we often think we need a certain level of expertise, like sort of scientific expertise, to begin to talk about it. And then the real crux of the issue for me is a sense of hypocrisy. A lot of people are scared to address the issue for fear of being called out as a hypocrite, because we're all responsible to some degree for the destruction that we're creating on our planet. And I think the key is to move past that, to accept that we don't have all the answers, none of us are experts, and that all of us are complicit to some degree in causing climate change. And once we can accept those two things, we can then have a dialogue about it. But I think that it's the fear of breaching, so having a discussion about this topic that's stopping a lot of the work being done. And that's why in the article, for me, the first thing for an institution to do is to tell the truth. So just to have an honest conversation about the scale of the crisis. And in a way that means acknowledging that we don't have the answers to how we're going to solve this, but it's from there that we can start to have a discussion, a debate, a dialogue. And I think that's what's not happening to the degree that it needs to be.
I wondered about whether some of the systems through which, particularly say we teach architecture, it can often be architects talking to architects. And I was wondering, you know, I think you've been part of groups which are bringing together engineers, they're bringing together those people who shape the built environment. And I was wondering how much you're starting to think around that as a model, but also thinking, you know, should there be more shared courses across all aspects of, say, university or higher education, where you sit with people who are learning about economics and actually you're listening to some of the same sorts of ideas about climate change, because it's not like it's just the built environment, it affects everybody in every aspect of it, which I think is what Citizen brings out in it. But I wonder how you're thinking about that and what the sort of collective thought.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think one of the dangers of trying to tackle climate change from any discipline, but architecture is a great example, is that we sort of exist within our siloed bubbles. And this is a challenge that is so all-encompassing that it requires cross-disciplinary approach to solving it. And I learned the value of having that approach firsthand while I was at Parsons, because the American education system allows you to take liberal arts credit, so you can dive into other courses that are nothing to do with your degree. And so I was able to take classes in economics and philosophy and ancient history and things that I never would have sort of dived into before. And it's these places where the best conversation was happening around how we start to tackle this issue. And so I think that that's part of when we talk about shifting education, one of the key conversations there is how do we become more cross-disciplinary? How do we expand our networks? And as you mentioned, I'm part of this group called the Architects Climate Action Network. And despite the name with architects in the front, it's actually quite cross-disciplinary. There's designers there are educators, there are engineers. There's a really broad range of individuals, and we used to meet before the pandemic every other week. And it just creates these really vibrant, rich conversations, also because you have a full spectrum from students to teachers to practitioners. And so I think that where, you know, diversity is key here, and that seems to be the case a lot of the time. So to come back to the notion of diversity, the more diverse we make our communities, the more diverse we make our systems, the more resilient they become, and the better we can start to tackle some of these problems, which again, like, I think it's really important to understand that Yuval Noah Harari talks about this, the Israeli historian and writer, that we have to first accept that the problems are so complex that have metastasized into such a sort of range of intersecting sort of dimensions that they're impossible to wrap our head around. They're daunting, and they're called wicked problems, right? They're sort of unsolvable to some degree. And so by acknowledging that, we should then understand that we need to change the way we traditionally solve issues, and that means, in my mind, a much more cross-disciplinary and broader approach. And a lot of the reading I've been doing over the last couple of weeks is in systems thinking. And again, I think this speaks to like needing to take a really wide perspective over how we think about the future and how we think about problem solving. And architecture to some degree looks at systems thinking, but it's still quite focused on, say, the built environment. And so how do we broaden that out? How do we look at the problems we're facing as a whole? And it's from there that we can start to maybe see what some of the foundational issues are that are causing all of them.
So you've spoken about quite a lot about conversations and about what we need to start looking at. And what you're amazing at doing is also taking action. So how do you start to see you can start to have a change and implement change in something like education, which is, as you say, so entrenched in certain institutional things? You know, what are you doing? What do you think other people can do? And what's the hope? Are you hopeful, or does it feel as though it's kind of another mountain to climb?
Right. Yeah. So taking action to me is like I sort of split it into two realms in my personal life. So one is, as you mentioned, my brother and I were quite involved with the Extinction Rebellion, and this type of action is a very loud public statement. It's taking to the streets. It's writing a sign that states your values or your ethics on it. We're certainly seeing it around the world right now with what's going on in terms of racial inequality. And this is like sort of one field of action, and it's about community. And in a way, there's a catharsis to it, like just shouting out your frustrations and your anger and making your voice heard is really important in terms of being an activist. But to me, that has to go hand in hand with the work, which in my mind is actually a bit harder and more nuanced, which is the work within our local communities, within our industries, within the spaces that we participate in every day. And so I found it easier to sort of paint the sign and go stand on the street outside Parliament and be like, take action on climate change. And then, of course, the question becomes after that, well, how are you doing that in your own life? And so for me, this has been starting to take action within I'm a student and have been a student for the last 5 years. So how can we start to shift our educational environment to respond to this issue? And the truth is, it's quite a slow and relentless process, but that's not a reason to not. That's even more of a reason to begin the work now. And if I've learned anything over my activism, it's that people respond best when you humanize the issue, right? Climate change can be really abstracted and very, if it comes down to numbers and melting glaciers in far off places, it's very hard for us to take action in our own life. Also, humans suffer from this sort of strange phenomenon called discounting the future, where even if we know that our action now will cause a problem in the future, we struggle to really come to terms with that. We're still going to take that action if it gives us a short-term gain. We sort of forget about that long-term issue that might be caused. So I think the key is to work at a community level and to speak with individuals in a way where they can understand how the issue will impact them in their own life. And for me personally, my turning point on climate change came during this first week when I went to Parsons School of Design, and I sat in a class. It was called Sustainable Systems, and we were asked to design a flood barrier to protect our cities from rising sea levels. And this was like a slap across the face for me, because it was the first time that I realized that my future was, selfishly, I was going to be impacted by climate change, and it was going to start to shift the career that I thought I was going to have. And so that sort of kicked me into action. And so I think that applies to everyone in whatever field they're in. It's meeting them in a place where they can start to understand how this will impact them and their family or friends or community. And then again, we can start to have that discussion about how we take action from there.
We're coming up to time, but I realized just was going to ask you a little bit about thinking around the idea of tomorrow and the future. And I was also, so there's two questions here. One is, are there some people who you look to for inspiration who are just kind of people, websites? I think people are sort of asking, you know, where are you getting your knowledge? As you say, it's often about education, self-education, education and popular. So where are you getting your knowledge, your inspiration from, and what's your thoughts for the future, whatever that tomorrow might be?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I just took, I sort of mentioned online courses. I can't recommend this highly enough. A friend, so actually part of this group I'm part of, the Architects Climate Action Network, sent out this course that's been published online, and it's free right now because of the pandemic, and it's called Think Resilience. And it's a 3-hour course over 21 lessons taught by an American writer called Richard Heimberg. He writes about energy, economics, and I had not heard of him before, nor heard of this course, and so I started taking it with a friend, and we did it over the sort of course of a week, and it's quite intensive, so I'd recommend sort of doing it over an extended period of time. But it just completely shifted my thinking. Again, it's obviously very focused on resilience, and so there are loads of resources online, like I mentioned. You know, I'd encourage for people looking for education in untraditional places. Obviously, there are a bunch of interesting books that, whether it's on climate change or racial inequality, that people are pointing towards at the moment. So I think we have to unlearn a lot of what we have been taught growing up, because the systems within which we exist, you know, we're realizing are fundamentally unsustainable, and that culturally we're quite deeply, there's a sort of myth in our culture, and this relates specifically to climate change, that we're sort of the masters and possessors of nature, and I think that is sort of one of the root causes of a lot of the issues we're facing, and you can relate that to the pandemic, and you can relate that to climate change. The truth is that as humans, we're actually quite vulnerable to novel natural disasters. And so I think we have to really fundamentally, and this is the work I'm doing on myself, is like, how do we re-question our relationship with the natural environment? And like I said, that applies across like what's happening right now with the pandemic, but also future challenges with climate change. So yeah, anything around those topics I'd recommend diving into. I was exposed to authors like Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein, Jeremy Rifkin, Wendell Berry. These are all people that sort of absolutely like turned my thinking upside down while I was at university. So that's on the reading front. And what's the second one? Oh yeah, the future. So what's interesting is, you know, any activist will move between mental states of feeling a little bit overwhelmed and daunted by the future, and then feeling optimistic by the sort of scale of opportunity for change. And coming out of this pandemic, I feel strangely optimistic. Because, as I mentioned, you know, we've been forced to slow down. And I think there are some really interesting questions that are being asked. For example, you know, do we value the well-being of our collective community over the success of our global economy, for example, which is a great question. And I think, to be honest, we started to see the answer to it. Or how do we build cities that are more resilient for an unstable future, which again, although it's sort of an uncomfortable truth, we know to some degree that we're looking at significant change in the future, and so resilience becomes the key. And so I think like I said, although we should acknowledge that a tragedy has unfolded, and I don't wish to say it's been that I'm glad it happened, there are loads of silver linings that have come from this tragedy. And I think they've made all of us a little bit more mindful, a little bit more aware. We've sort of been forced to stop and think and reflect on fundamentally what we value. And I really fundamentally believe that all of us will, and this work is still happening now, right, with the riots that are happening this week, the protests. We're all being forced to reckon with things that we just perhaps weren't addressing before. They were easy to just sort of put to the side and charge forward. But now we're being forced to reckon with them, and it's uncomfortable work. But I do believe that globally, as a global society, we will be in a better position to start to have an honest conversation about where are the fundamental issues with our collective narrative and the societies we live in, that we can start to change and adjust. And my generation is daunted by that challenge, but I think ready to do that work.
It also seems that, you know, it's not over. I mean, I think we are right. Also, things are being completely unpicked, and I think it's every likelihood we're going into global recession and what that starts to mean actually for, you know, some of these institutions may break or have to rethink themselves, particularly education, for instance, which has its business model has been so based upon overseas students, which has been topped up. Will that be a reality? What does it mean to be leaner, to be less doing, and actually making sure that what rises within that is not, you know, is this kind of need to be teaching differently and thinking differently. And actually it's a time to make change and do courage rather than just to do what you've done before. And there's a kind of, I guess it takes courage for institutions to be able to do that and to be able to put these values, as you say, that have been learned in these moments into action. And it sounds as though, you know,
I think you're right. I think that if we're talking about education, this pandemic in particular is going to create an unprecedented pressure. As you said, students are either deferring to go next year or just simply cancelling their place because they're not wishing to pay for a term that's going to be completely online. And so this creates certainly a crisis for educational institutions that are reliant on that income and that student body. But again, you know, if we can draw optimism from this, it's that in the face of crisis is when we have the best opportunity to create change. And so, you know, now is the time for these institutions to be taking, you know, the summer holidays, for example, to really self-reflect. And I think the truth is that if educational spaces, institutions aren't responding to some of these challenges, aren't offering educational resources that are really relevant and up to date, they're going to lose students anyway. So you know, this might be a forced reckoning. I think now is the best opportunity they've ever had to have a discussion on how they should be pivoting accordingly. And again, we're starting to see those changes now, and it's about students being part of that conversation as well. We shouldn't rely on these sort of institutions and these higher powers to create changes. We should all lean in and work together towards reframing how we would wish to learn in the future. And I think that's a really critical point to make. And that's what I mean about, there's one thing to protest with a sign and say, I'm not happy, but then it's another to do the work in terms of trying to restructure your environment around you to be better adapted to the changes that you're worried about.
Thank you. That's probably a brilliant way to end it. I think a call to arms for all of us. And it's not up to the students to do it. It's up to all of us to demand that of our education systems, and also then that there's the practices who are living through those things, that actually when you come out as a student, there is ways in which actually we can put all of these things into action. And so, Finn, I look forward to seeing what you do next, today, tomorrow, and, you know, the sort of architecture and buildings and contribution you make to making better cities, better buildings, and a better life. So thank you very much for joining us. And,
thank you for having me, Kate.
And see you soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, and thanks everybody for listening in. And do look at all those amazing kind of references that Finn has given us. I think there's lots of learning for all of us to do and to get involved. So thank you. Bye.
Thanks, guys.